Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. It's always wonderful to find a book or story written in a unique voice, a book that challenges writing conventions or that follows quirky but lovable characters. Listeners, I've just finished a book that ticks all those boxes. Her Fidelity, published by Penguin and written by Sydney-based author Katharine Pollock, takes a humorous yet insightful look at the male-dominated record industry from the point of view of a female retail worker. A sharply drawn snapshot of contemporary Australian society and an exploration of what it means to be a woman working in a male-dominated industry, Her Fidelity was funny and sobering at the same time. I'm delighted to welcome Katharine to the podcast today to chat about her book. Hi, Katharine.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. It's been a while since this book hit the shelves, so I was wondering, how are you feeling about its reception?
Yeah, so far so good. So it came out mid-August. I could probably tell you the exact second because it was, such a thrilling moment. The kind of, initial flush of fame has started to fade, so to speak, which has been partly nice. I can finally breathe a little bit and relax, but it was, of course, such a thrilling and continues to be such a thrilling time. In terms of the reception, it seems to be mostly received quite well. Lots of generous responses, lots of people saying that it resonates with their experiences, whether or not they're in music, which, as you say, there are some sobering elements. So I'm never quite sure how to respond to that, if it's a good thing or not. I really need to tease out what it is that they relate to before I offer a, celebration or solidarity type of response. But yeah, overall quite good, which has been really just lovely and heartening and quite validating as well. Yeah.
Indeed. Fantastic. I didn't quite say it in my introduction, but it is your debut novel and it is so brilliant. I mean, I never cease to be amazed at the quality and the standard of debut fiction in this country. Absolutely amazing.
Well, thank you so much. That really means a lot. Obviously, yep, I'm sure that the feeling never fades, but particularly with the debut, it was, it's always a little nerve-wracking to kind of see it go out into the world. And it doesn't even quite feel real until, at least in my experience, the first week or two. And then I started to, realize I wasn't dreaming. So yeah, absolutely. That really means a lot. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, you're most definitely not dreaming. It is out there, as you can see behind my head. There's a lovely copy of your beautiful book sitting there. Just wonderful. So, Katharine, I understand that it's based largely on your own experiences working in independent record stores in Brisbane and Sydney. So I wanted to ask you, what specifically sparked the idea for the novel? Was it a particular event or more an accumulation of experiences that made you want to bring the story to the page?
Yeah, definitely the latter, not so much any singular event, although I will say one of the moments that's written about in the book involving a bodily substance appearing on the floor may be drawn somewhat from my life. And that certainly was the motivation for me to go back to university to study my creative writing degree. So predating this actual book, but certainly part of the lead up to it. I thought I can't do full-time retail in that environment anymore. I've been, as you say, I've worked in independent record stores, mostly in Brisbane in terms of the longest stretch of time. So from when I was about 14 until about 29 across a couple of different places, and then a few years here in Sydney where I'm based now. Truthfully, a lot of what I wrote about in broad strokes wasn't even necessarily just from those environments. It was from, all the other retail type of jobs I've had for, front-facing occupations that I've had, as well as a variety of other experiences. So it was definitely a kind of just combined effect of, having so much time spent in the coal mines. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So for those listeners out there who haven't read it yet, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
Yeah, certainly. So it follows a protagonist whose name is Kathy, which eagle-eyed or eared listeners might note is a variation of my name. But it is not disingenuous to sort of say that it is very much a work of fiction. So as we discussed, it's certainly informed or influenced by, I suppose, the context of my life, emotional experiences and, funny sorts of characters that you encounter in those spaces. but it's very much a fictional character on a fictional journey. So it's the story of Kathy, who is around 29 for the majority of the novel, who's been working in Dusty's Records in Brisbane, which is in the book the basically last and only independent record store in Queensland, or in Brisbane specifically. And she's worked there since she was about 14 or 15, alongside a bunch of lads who she has, I would say, a fraught relationship with. She adores them, but as she matures and, has a bit of a reckoning, she starts to sort of reevaluate the nature of the dynamics between her and a lot of the fellows that she works with, not least of all the owner of the shop, who is given the name Dusty. She works with a friend called Mel, so the only other woman in that space who has worked there for about 20 years and is a little bit older than Kathy, and they have a very special relationship. And she also has another friend called Alex, who basically isn't interested in music, or not that type of music, but is a lifelong friend since about preschool or primary school. So it's basically just the story of Kathy moving through the world, almost a sort of a coming of age, but as a late bloomer is how I like to frame it. So it's certainly not YA fiction, but to me, it has some of those resonances of coming to grips with who you are and who you want to be. I think Kathy is not always her best self. So it's very much a journey of not just learning what she deserves from those around her, but also what she should give other people and herself as well.
Speaking of Kathy, I thought she was a very nuanced character who seemed simultaneously self-aware, but not altogether perceptive about her surroundings. I know the book is largely based on your own experiences, but tell me more about how you came to craft Kathy's character.
There are certain things that we share in common. Obviously, the broad strokes of our resumes are quite similar. I also tend to, feel most comfortable and free around small groups of intimate friends rather than in kind of big group settings. In some ways, she's extremely different. So I like to joke that I'm vegan and she eats too much cheese. She's perhaps got a little bit of she's on the borderline of alcoholism, I would perhaps say, to put it gently, which I'm not. But I like to think of her as being a kind of a amped up, accidental music pun there, amped up version of who I was when I was quite a bit younger. I like to think that I'm more mature in some ways. I think it ebbs and flows. If you speak to my fiance at various times, he might, he might say that's not the case if I'm particularly hungry or something like that. I wanted to make sure she was not just a transcription or a reflection of me. I didn't want this to be a work of memoir for a variety of reasons, but mostly because I just was really invested in crafting a good fictional story, but also because, and it might sound perhaps a little highfalutin, but I wanted this story to, as I was saying before about the reception, to resonate with loads of other girls and women and just anyone really. And I felt that if I confine the story to me as a memoir, it would be less interesting and it might be less relatable as well. That's a bit of a long way around about my intentions, but in terms of how I went about it, I think it makes it sound simpler than perhaps it is, but it wasn't necessarily conscious, a lot of the development or crafting of her character, but I wanted her to be almost excruciatingly honest and candid. And so I created a character that at times would embarrass me when I got into that headspace. I wanted her to be quite cringe-inducing, but I think that it paid off. She's not always likable, although, as I said, that's quite intentional. But also I think it does make her quite endearing and trustworthy in a way, which might sound strange because I agree. I don't think she's necessarily a reliable narrator in terms of she doesn't always quite have the strongest sense of what's going on around her. There's a lot of willful denial and just kind of plain and simple denial. But I think that we can trust that she's being emotionally authentic.
Yeah, indeed. Very, very clever. And I must say, perhaps revealing my own ignorance, that I never really thought of the record industry, or specifically the indie record stores, as a male domain. But clearly this is an issue that you wanted to shine a light on. So I wondered if you could tell me more about your experience with this and why you wanted to explore it in the context of this novel.
Certainly. Yeah. So whenever I'm sort of wrestling with that question of how much is me, how much is her, I think the real way in which it's reflective of my real life is just exactly that I've lived firsthand through, being one of a precious few women or marginalized people in in any room in those spaces. And it's true that I think a lot of people don't quite recognize the music industry, and specifically, as you say, indie record stores, as being this very male dominated and quite macho. Maybe macho is the wrong word, kind of masculine, as made up as that sort of category is. But when I think about it, when I sat down to write this novel, I realized that it wasn't just the actual employees of the shops I'd worked at that the kind of gender ratio was skewed. It was also the customers, and it was also the product. It was the artists on the records on the shelves. Most of the music still to this day would be by men, and a lot of people in the kind of behind the scenes of the record and music industry would still largely be men. It's of course shifting, and of course I use terms like men and woman, recognizing the distinction between gender and sex, but in terms of that kind of unequal dynamic, unfortunately, while I do believe it's shifting quite a lot, it does still persist. So it was really important to me to show people who weren't aware of that was a problem, or perhaps even more so to show why and how it is a problem. Because I think a lot of the time, just because you're one of a few, some people would have a hard time with recognizing, what's even wrong with that, I wanted to reveal that it's not just harassment and abuse, although that occurs and certainly occurs in the novel, but sometimes it's just not feeling seen or heard or represented, and how isolating and limiting that can be for a person's autonomy and confidence and things like that. So I wanted to sort of reveal that. And I suppose for those who are already aware of it, I wanted it to be, depending on where you're sitting in that spectrum, either be deliberately, I suppose, confronting and provocative, or if you're a marginalized person, reaffirming and validating in some way.
You touched on this a little bit in your answer. And what I wanted to say was that what I appreciated through Kathy's story is not so much that the industry was male dominated, and I accept that was something you wanted to spotlight in this novel, but the inherent misogyny that came with it. For example, the fact that she, as one of the two female employees, was expected to do the cleaning and the coffee runs, that she was treated as if she knew less about the industry or about music than her male counterparts, no matter how socially inept or dysfunctional they happen to be, and that she was expected to put up with the abuse and harassment of customers as part of the deal. How close to your own experiences were Kathy's experiences in the novel?
Again, in terms of the actual scenarios, they were invented, and in terms of the characters, they were invented, as well as a sort of composite sketch of the different sort of archetypal personalities I've encountered. But unfortunately, in terms of experiencing a lot of out and out hostility, misogyny, and I suppose just diminishment would be the word I'd be searching for. I've experienced a great deal of that in my time, particularly when I was younger. So I started as a work experience kid, so 14, and if memory serves, 9 months was the age I was legally allowed to start. I think, like a lot of people, and dare I say perhaps a lot of girls, I just wasn't sure of myself at that age. I wasn't sure what was right, what was wrong, even what I liked and didn't like, in terms of not just my tastes, which is quite crucial in that sort of environment, cultivating and demonstrating your superior tastes, so to speak, but also what I liked and disliked in terms of people's behavior towards me. I think when you're young and insecure, you can mistake objectification for, good attention, for flattery. And it's only sort of years later that you realize that it's done a bit of a number on you. So certainly that was, at least speaking for myself, which is all I really can do, that was my experience. I didn't necessarily speak up for myself in real time in a lot of these situations, only really upon reflection, when I've revisited a lot of these scenarios, have I realized how terrible they were. I used to tell a few stories on, I can't remember where I heard this term, but someone said, do you have a greatest hits reel of funny anecdotes, that you sort of pull out at dinner parties and things like that? And I used to tell a couple of stories, and it was only when people stopped laughing and sort of said, oh, that's actually really quite traumatic and disturbing, that I was kind of forced to reckon with it and go, you're right. So I guess, even though I said before, I think I'm more self-aware and aware of others than the Kathy of my novel, it would be disingenuous to say that it was immediate, and that, you know, there's perhaps still things that I'm clocking and, you know, reframing and reconsidering in my brain. I think a lot of the time when you work with people who you do have that tense kind of fraught relationship with, you adore them, and they're not entirely bad people through and through. You know, none of us really are, or most of us really aren't. Perhaps some exceptions to the rule. It can be hard to draw those lines. You don't want to ice people out or make people into villains and things like that. So I think it's a kind of a complicated and highly personal journey for all of us.
You wouldn't be alone in that regard. I mean, as young kids, we all took the retail job, and it's often your first real encounter with the public at large or society at large. And I always say to my children, being in retail, you see the best and the worst of humanity a lot of the time. I think when you're young and inexperienced, you don't know where the lines are, and you don't necessarily understand those nuances between behavior that is okay or behavior that crosses the line necessarily.
Exactly. In fact, just talking to you and listening to you now, I'm remembering, I could be mistaken in thinking it was my first day, but certainly my first week of work experience, a customer who it was, you know, was described to me as being just a friendly regular. So, you know, already I'm sort of being told how to respond to people. And there's that sort of mantra of the customer is always right as well. Within my first day or week, I was, around 14 and a half. And I had a fellow who would have been at least 30, probably tipping over to 40, I would say, who immediately said, "Oh, you're new here. We should go for a coffee sometime," yada, yada, yada. And again, I remember feeling a little, you know, to use a definitely real term, skeezed out. But but you know, again, in that strange bind of not knowing what was an appropriate reaction to have in a, you know, semi quasi professional environment, and what was something that I considered to be quite flattering as well.
Kathy's persona is wrapped up in her music taste. She's quite judgmental of people who have different taste to hers, isn't she?
Yeah, definitely. Again, this was one of the ways in which, if I limited it to my experience, it wouldn't have been half as entertaining. Not to say that I haven't internalized a lot of not just misogyny, as we've sort of touched on or teased out, but also that sort of archetypal classic snooty record store personality. But she very much goes through a long period of being quite disdainful towards people's tastes. What I was trying to capture there was something that, to my mind, is not confined just to music or to record stores. A lot of what I wrote in the book, I feel, would be familiar to people who've never even worked in customer service, let alone a record store, or don't particularly care for music. But that idea of you define your whole personality when you're young based on what you like, and perhaps to a greater extent, depending on who you are, what you don't like. Being very judgmental as a way of saying, you know, listen to me, see me, this is who I am, and I'm really cool, you know? And I think it's obviously a pretty complicated thing. A lot of it is still swept up in the misogyny of it all, you know, dismissing pop music and things like that as being uncool, you know, as very much being a reflection of dismissing what girls traditionally have liked. There's been a lot of, even some scholarship on that and documentaries and things in recent years, which is quite nice to see. But yeah, in a broad sense as well, outside of the, I suppose, gender dynamic, I think I was just trying to sort of reflect that stage of life that a lot of us go through of being, quite disdainful, and not always even necessarily realizing that you are being quite horrid. You're just sort of trying to make your mark in the world.
Going back to our earlier discussion about misogyny, there's something that happens to Kathy in this book that was quite confronting for me, because I not really had any real understanding of it. It's characterized as another form of abuse that I'm sure I've never read about in a book before. I wanted to know, Katharine, if you could tell me more about this and why it was important for you to explore in the context of this novel.
Yeah, definitely, Claudine. So Kathy has, I suppose, a one night stand with a person who's not really, speaking of tastes, her usual taste, but she's, you know, branching out, she's bored, she's this, that, and the other, and she goes home with this individual. And I suppose, to avoid spoilers, but also being too triggering, maybe I can just frame it as a, you know, non-consensual sexual act is what she experiences. Happy to say more, but I'm not sure how much detail to go into there. But in short, something happens to her or is done to her that she, again, doesn't necessarily realize has occurred immediately, and it's only kind of after that it sort of sinks in for her. I very intentionally wanted to put that moment into the book to again reflects that idea that a lot of what she experiences, good or bad, is not confined just to music. To me, music and the record industry is, if nothing else, an exemplar of, wider society and what we as women, commonly can endure. The idea that abuse and harassment is something that bleeds into personal life very much as well. So the person that she has this encounter with is only really peripherally involved in kind of music and in the Dusties sort of record shop space. So I wanted to sort of suggest that it's not just one area of your life that you can kind of work out, parcel out, and figure out what's wrong and what's right. It's absolutely everything, and that includes casual sex, all kinds of sex and intimacy and relationship sort of areas, I suppose. Speaking of the, I suppose, readers' response to this book, that has been quite an interesting moment in the book where it has been mentioned. People have responded quite well to it, I think, in terms of, I wanted to make sure I was handling it delicately enough to not sort of re-traumatize or traumatize people or anything like that, but at the same time to illuminate what I see as being the seriousness of situations like that. Some, not many, one or two people of an older generation, and certainly not generalizing in any stretch, beyond saying that I think societally we're shifting, particularly post Me Too, but one or two people didn't quite understand or didn't quite agree that it was an instance of sexual assault. The particular moment, it depends on the country that you're in, whether or not it is legally classified as sexual assault, which is quite interesting, I think. And, everyone has different responses to their own interactions with people and their own conceptualizations of what is and is not trauma, etc. But to my mind, I wanted to show that almost murkier, I personally wouldn't even call it a gray area, but for want of an expression, gray area of sexual interactions where, enthusiastic consent, if it's absent, it is something at best problematic. And if not, at worst, illegal and violating. It was perhaps one of the most difficult passages to write in terms of treading that line between being kind of implicit and explicit, all those different tensions. But as well, I wanted, because this book is quite heavy on sexism, I wanted it to, again, be something that was recoverable from. I wanted to show how you can be victimized, but you can also survive and thrive, And so I think Kathy represses or suppresses a lot of things that happen to her, including this, for some time, for as long as she can, but eventually it bubbles up and she responds and reacts. But in doing so, I think kind of, frees herself and stops blaming herself as well.
Without belaboring the point, I think from what follows in the book, it's clear that, Kathy is shocked by how many women have had a similar experience to her. And yet her male colleagues, to the extent that they were interested in finding out what had happened at all, didn't want to know. And it certainly never occurred to them that this might not be an okay thing to do to someone else. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I wanted to really illuminate in the book, and I suppose I keep using terms like illuminate because, as well as showing examples of these different things, I certainly didn't want the book to be didactic or, overly polemic. I didn't want it to be an instructional guide or an academic resource. I explored a lot of this stuff in my PhD, so I could get a lot more technical and academic about it if I wanted to, but just like the sort of memoir of it all type of question, to my mind, it would be a bit of a turnoff to readers to be too instructional and moralizing, I suppose. So by showing just different characters' responses and reactions to that situation and to Kathy in general, I felt it was just a kind of a funner way of, perhaps a more digestible way of showing how this can kind of play out in real life. With that said, it was really important to me to show, again, not just the large scale moments of whether it's physical, emotional, or mental abuse, harassment, etc., to show what to my mind is more troubling personally, in my experience, is when male friends around me don't listen to me in favor of, they don't want to consider themselves or their friends as being bad guys, so to speak. I think we've seen instances of this playing out in the culture. The sort of controversy around Aziz Ansari being accused of non-consensual sexual acts a few years ago occurs to me, in various other examples. But it's one thing to be an abuser or to harass, etc., but it's another thing to not listen to your particularly female or marginalized friends when they tell you that something has happened to them, and even more so if it's at the hands of themselves or those around them. I think we can't shift the conversation and change behaviors if we can't admit some degree of complicity, or at best complacency when it occurs to us. Yeah.
I've spoken before on this podcast about the concept of the good bloke. The fact that, because someone is a good bloke, they're immediately almost immune from any kinds of allegations of this nature. It couldn't possibly be true because that guy is a good guy or a good bloke.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I've seen this a lot in my personal life and the broader kind of culture and society as well. And I think it's very disingenuous to think that any one of us have never perpetrated any kind of bad behavior. I'm sure that I've internalized misogyny even as a woman. I'm sure I've perpetuated other kinds of microaggressions or had prejudices against people without ever meaning to or wanting to. But when we live in a society that, is very slowly and begrudgingly evolving, we're going to, internalize and therefore perpetuate some behaviors. And I think the most helpful thing we can do is to admit to it and try to do better, over and over and over again. And we will keep failing, but that's what we have to do as a society and as individuals. And it's not just better for our, victims or for people who are hurt, but it's better for ourselves as well, I think.
Another theme running through this book is female friendships. Kathy shares a wonderful friendship with her childhood friend Alex, the person that you mentioned before, and her work colleague Mel. But for most of this book, I have to say, the friendship seems rather one-sided. Kathy isn't a particularly good friend, is she?
No, she's not. As a introvert in my now heading up to mid-30s, I can kind of relate to being sort of less social and not as reciprocal as I should be as a friend, although I do try to be more or as involved as I can be in my friends' lives. But I say that slightly facetiously. Of course, I think friendship is really where it's at, and that can be, the friends that you have in your family, the friends you have as your pets, the friendship you have with yourself. There are various ways of, having friends, but it was very important to me to show female friendship particularly as a kind of refreshing counterbalance to all of this horrid stuff that Kathy endures. To show how very differently minded people can still be friends was really important to me as well. But also to show, as you say, that if you have the bones, the skeleton of a good friendship in there, you can weather the storm of, a slightly one-sided friendship within limits. I'm not sure if I would be quite as patient with Kathy as Mel and Alex are with her, but thankfully for her, they are, sort of enduring. They're certainly not fair weather friends. But again, that's part of her coming of age, is that she has to acknowledged where she's being quite selfish and not being a support system for her friends, only really taken and not given. She sort of has to realize that she has to offer them more than just sheer entertainment and, some badly quoted Nicolas Cage lines and things like that, which I think she does make a very concerted effort to do and does ultimately achieve. But again, just like what we were talking about before, it's something that, and I'm talking as though the Kathy of the book is real and is out there in the world with Mel and Alex. Maybe she is in my mind a little bit still. She'll have to keep doing over and over again for the rest of her life. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. So one really interesting aspect of this book that I've never come across before is the fact that there are no speech marks at all throughout the entire book. So
Yes.
tell me about that, and why did you want to present your work this way?
Yes, definitely. I had a message on social media from a reader saying, I've just noticed there's nothing around the dialogue. Was this a mistake? And I just sat there laughing for about a minute straight, not at this person, bless their heart, but the idea that it would not only get through all of my drafts, but past my editor and publisher as well, as just one ongoing omission in a typo form, really cracked me up. So it was definitely intentional. But I will say that the first iteration of the novel did have dialogue markers, did have quotation marks, I should say. And it just didn't sit right with me when I was looking at it. It felt as though, I don't know, it felt as though I were reading a contrived work. And I wanted this book to be a confessional, straight from the heart, no filter sort of expression. I suppose for me, it was a way of making what she's not just saying, but thinking very immediate, and to kind of blur the lines between what is her internal dialogue and what is actual dialogue as well. I've seen it in a few things, not a lot of things, but I've always enjoyed the sort of immediacy of that, of what happens when you strip away quotation marks, and as much as possible without it being confusing, he said, she said, etc., almost making it not epistolary, but almost more as much like a diary as it, I suppose, as it could be, without it, again, sort of risking being interpreted as memoir or something to that effect.
Yeah, I found it fascinating. I really did. I was reading along and thought, oh, hang on a minute. And I did. I think you did achieve that immediacy with this, and I felt closer to Kathy as a reader than I probably would have otherwise.
Excellent. I'm really, really glad to hear that. It's sometimes, I think, with those more sort of technical craft-based choices, it's never easy to know how they're going to play out until readers respond. So yeah, that means a lot. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm interested to know what your publisher thought of that.
Yeah, I think they didn't certainly raise the existence of the quotation marks when they were there as an issue. I just sort of threw it up as a possibility, and they said, go for gold. They were very flexible with a lot of, whether it was me incorporating their decisions or me voicing my own options. They were very, very much gave me autonomy in that space, which was fabulous. But yeah, I think it worked for them. I got a good response from them. So yeah, we just rolled with it.
Fantastic. I love hearing that. Katharine, if there was one thing you'd like readers to take away or listeners to take away from this book, what would it be?
It would be that you don't have to have everything figured out all at once. And indeed, perhaps you never will have it all figured out. And that's perfectly fine. We're all fallible beings, walking meat sacks on this dusty old planet. And we're just figuring it out. And that's okay. So, if you can do the least harm as you consciously can in any given moment, that's a win. But just trying to move through the world with love is, I suppose, what I was trying to put in the book, as well as with joy, which is why, while there's a lot of darkness in it, it was very important for me that it be a humorous novel as well. So I hope that if people read it and it makes them laugh, it doesn't have to be any more profound than that, really. Maybe we'll erase my first ambitious answer and settle on that. I just want people to laugh, really, and just feel okay for, however many pages it is. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Katharine, you hold a PhD in Humanities and Communication Arts from Western Sydney University. You've been a writer in residence at Varuna. You were a visiting writer at the National Young Writers Festival in 2019. And in 2021, you also won the Queensland Writers Centre GenreCon Short Story Competition. And your work has appeared in a variety of publications. So what I wanted to know was, with all of those experiences and achievements under your belt, what advice would you give to writers and aspiring authors out there?
Yeah, definitely. I would say just keep trying. There's bound to be missteps and failures and rejections, and I've certainly experienced a whole bunch of those in my time as a writer. And it doesn't all make you stronger, but most of it does, I think, give you some kind of resilience. Being open to criticism and feedback while recognizing that it's not all a reflection of reality is a difficult thing to strike, a balance to strike, but I think is really important. In terms of doing the writing, it would be just writing for really yourself or whoever you see as being the most kind of receptive reader, someone who's not going to be critical. So not writing for your inner critic or for a general readership or anything like that. In terms of taking it beyond that, it would be kind of the same thing. If you're trying to get published, just keep trying and don't give up. But my one sort of maybe more material piece of advice, which comes from my trial and error, would be to, while it's great to cast your net widely and shoot for the sun, to also have a more of a keen eye for what's the best home for me. And that home might be the publisher, the agent, or even just a writing group, but trying to find like-minded people who will, get you and appreciate you is really important as well.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. That's wonderful
So
advice.
much. My pleasure.
Katharine, are you working on something else at the moment?
I am actually. I am close to 2/3 of the way through my second novel, which is really thrilling. There's quite a big redraft ahead once I've finished it, which I'm now kind of aware of, but I'm sort of not trying to get too far into, that murky terrain. I have been a little bit less industrious with it of late. Life gets in the way, but I've been trying to do some short stories and things like that to sort of at least keep, the neural pathways active. Yeah, so a few things in the pipeline, but mostly my second novel. So fingers crossed.
Katharine, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, primarily they can find me on Instagram. So my handle is @thatrecordstoregirl. I believe if you search for my full name, Katharine Pollock, you'll find me there as well. Do be prepared for guinea pig pictures and pictures of my getting earring collection, but there is some writerly things that you'll find there as well. I've sort of abandoned various other social medias and websites, so that would be the best place to find me.
Katharine, I so enjoyed Her Fidelity, such a humorous and thought-provoking book. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.